back to Wickedly Judged, the podcast dedicated to exposing wrongful convictions and fighting for justice reform in America. I'm Rebecca, and if you're new here, this show is for anyone who believes that justice isn't just a verdict. It's a promise, a process, and far too often, a fight. At Wickedly Judged, we shine a light on the cracks in our justice system by sharing the real stories of those who have been wrongfully accused, convicted, and forgotten by the courts. We give a voice to the families, advocates, and survivors who refuse to accept injustice as the end of their story. Before we dive in, I want to thank the organizations and individuals who make this podcast possible. A huge thank you to our supporters, Veteran Alliance, Yarn Therapy for Me, Justin Apron, Liberty First Radio, NDVLB, and Prime Ledger Group. And a special thanks to JP Verse of Versifier Records for providing our powerful intro and outro music. Your support fuels our mission. Thank you for standing with us in the fight to expose wrongful convictions and demand true justice. Today we're going to do things a little bit different. We're taking on a topic that's everywhere right now, and it's often oversimplified. No cash bail and bail reform. Because pretrial detention can punish poverty before a case is ever proven in court. Yet any reform also has to be honest about how policy changes affect real people, real courtrooms, and real community safety. For this conversation, I sat down with Ken W. Good, a Texas bail attorney and a board member of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. This is a pre-recorded interview with Ken, and he brings a perspective from inside the bail system, what's working, what isn't, and what he believes reform should consider if we want outcomes that are fair, constitutional, and accountable. All right, let's get into it. Here's my pre-recorded interview with Ken Good. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Wickedly Judged. Today we have a guest who is a little bit different than our normal wrongful conviction guest, but it does kind of tie in together. Today we have Ken Good on the show. He is an attorney from Texas. Hey Ken, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, so thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being willing to come on and talk to us. Now, I know you kind of focus on no cash bail subject, so it's a little off of my wrongful conviction that I normally try to stay in, but at the same time, it kind of ties in.
Yeah, it ties in with, it's all criminal justice related, and it's talking about how do we get people to go to court, what assurances do they need to give to the court, what's the court's discretion, what are consequences if you fail to appear, and it's really how do we get the case through the system so that if they're found guilty, they can go on and serve their time, or if they're found innocent, they can be released.
Absolutely. Now, when people hear the term no cash bail, what are they usually misunderstanding about it? Like, what does it mean in actual practice?
I think the biggest misunderstanding that we have about our bail system, because we hear it all the time from the activists, well, there's a presumption of innocence. There's a presumption of innocence. So why should they have to do anything to get out of jail? But the problem is the case law has already addressed that probably decades ago. The presumption of innocence applies at the trial of the case, and everybody's presumed to be innocent. They can't be forced to testify against themselves. But pre-trial, what we're talking about is what assurances are you going to give to the court that you're going to come back and respond to these charges? That's the whole concept. If you can't assure the court that you're going to come back, then the court has the right to hold you until your criminal criminal cases resolved. So I think the biggest misperception about pretrial release is what assurances are going to be given that you're going to return. And if you have a longer criminal history, well, then criminal history is probably the best predictor of what's going to happen going forward. So if you've got a long criminal history, then the chances that you will fail to appear or you're not going to come back increase substantially. And so we should not treat everybody the same way on pretrial release.
With what you're saying about pretrial release, what are the different risks and different accountabilities with each different type of pretrial release?
Well, there's, like you said, there's different types of pretrial release. And, like in Texas, there's probably 3. And in other states, there may be a couple more. But like in Texas, there's the private surety bail system. It acts like an insurance policy. So when you get out of jail, you are hiring a bail bondsman to post a bond in the full amount of whatever the judge sets the bond. And you're paying like an insurance policy. You're paying a premium. And what the bondsman is promising is that if you don't show up, they're going to pay the full amount of the bond to the court. So on a $25,000 bond, you may pay a premium of $2,500, but if you fail to appear for court, the bondsman is going to end up paying the court $25,000 if you don't return and you don't return timely. The other 2 types of release that Texas recognizes is one, cash bonds, where instead of paying a premium, you post $25,000 cash with the court. That doesn't happen very often. And then you've got simple release, where you're just being released on your promise to come back. In Texas, we call those pretrial bonds, personal bonds. And in other places, they're called other things. In New York, it'd be called release on no bond. And in California, it'd be release on zero bail. But they're all the same thing. You're being released on your promise, and only your promise to come back. And those have a very high failure to appear rate. In fact, in some places like Harris County, we have data of 2 years where that type of release has an 83% on average failure to appear rate. And that has a devastating impact on criminal cases, because criminal cases can't go forward without you. And so if you fail to appear, the case gets put on hold until you come back. So I think those are the main types of release that we see in every type of state. And then they may have a couple more they add to it, but they're just variations of the same thing. So how do they differ on risk? Well, the private industry has the lowest failure to appear rate, less than 10%. Cash bonds have twice the failure to appear rate of the private industry, or higher, probably 25 to 50%. And then the simple release has a high failure to appear rate between 50, 75, and in some places 80% failure to appear rate. Those can have, so you can see the different release systems has a profound impact on the criminal justice system. And we see that because if your case gets put on hold, it's put on hold till you come back. It's just a question of how long you're gone. And so we can have backlogs build up. And when backlogs get to a certain point, there's pressure on the courts to dismiss cases to prevent the criminal justice system from collapsing. And I think what we're seeing is the courts start dismissing cases. Criminals see that as a green light to commit more crime. And the more failure to appears you have, the higher the backlog. The courts just can't hold anybody accountable. And so accountability gets lost. And again, when you have no accountability, criminals see that as a green light to commit more crime.
And then crime rates go up and more victims, yes. And it becomes a huge or a bigger problem than what it would have initially been had they just showed up to court, went through the whole trial process.
Well, look at California. We changed certain felonies to misdemeanors, and the misdemeanors the big one was we got theft under $950. Then our prosecutors in certain urban areas decided they quit prosecuting that. Well, that has led to major shoplifting, companies closing because they can't withstand $25,000 a day of shoplifting. And then that's caused crime in the areas to go up. That's caused commercial property values to just go through the basement. They're selling for 30 to 50% of what they were selling just 5 years before. So a decision that you could see maybe was well intended, but it's had devastating impacts on public safety and the criminal justice system and society in general.
Absolutely. Because, the prosecutors look at it under $950, for one person. But if you've got 10 people doing that at the same exact place, that's devastating to a small business.
Well, and then there's groups that have stepped in there. So organized crime, gangs, and career criminals they have found ways to make millions and millions of dollars, good intentions.
Yep, I agree. So with this whole no cash bail, what do you think that bail reform was trying to solve originally, and what parts of it were actually valid?
I think the real issue of what they were trying to solve is the very heart of the criminal justice system. So, we don't want everybody to be treated the same. We only want the criminal justice system to have to impose just enough pressure on you when you get arrested so that you turn around and become productive. And the system was built to then only apply the pressure needed on me to make me turn around and be productive. The amount of pressure that would need to be imposed on you versus me isn't the same. And so I think the perception from the activists was that we needed to change the system, take away discretion from the judges, and treat everybody the same out of either some racial or some equity argument. And the offender should not be treated the same with someone who has 10-year criminal history. And in this push for bail reform, this cookie cutter where we treat everybody the same based on their charges, no matter how many times they've been arrested, I think that's based and wrong. And I don't think that's a valid argument. I think it's turned out to be an invalid argument. And I think the time since then has proven that. But the problem is that activists, even to this day, will not admit that those policies are not working. They won't admit that the policy of making theft under $950, not prosecuting it, was wrong. They won't admit that these cookie cutter release systems are making us less safe. And so I don't think there was anything valid in their proposals.
Okay. So if someone has, say, 14 prior arrests, what should the public know about the difference between the arrests, the difference in the charges, the convictions, and any pending cases when they're actually evaluating their risk?
Well, but the risk is the failure to appear or to return to answer the criminal charges. What is the risk that you're going to run? A lot of times the activists want to stay focused on, well, what's the risk of a willful failure to appear? Willful is intentional. So they want to excuse any accidental, any I overslept, any I just forgot about it, or any careless failure to appear, because they don't realize that both failures to appear, willful and not unwillful, commits the same damage to the criminal justice system. Both cases have to be put on hold till you return. Both cases can't go forward. They both create the same amount of backlogs, but they don't want to allow the trial court to have the discretion to hold you accountable in both situations. Under their argument, as long as you're just stupid, you can miss court 20 times, but if it's intentional, you can't miss court but once. That's not a good argument. In that situation, the non-willful, the stupid failures to appear would do more damage than the willful ones. What they don't really tell the public is a lot of times we're putting on top of all this a Speedy Trial Act requirement. Look in California, they use these simple release mechanisms for misdemeanors. And I did a podcast with a DA from California. He said, misdemeanors have a 80% failure to appear rate in California because they use these simple release mechanisms. But on top of that, they have a Speedy Trial Act requirement. So if you miss court and you don't come back, there's a deadline for the court to get the case resolved, or they dismiss it. So you can go hide, and you can benefit from that under that Speedy Trial Act requirement. That's just gaming the system, and we should never set up a system that allows that.
So honestly, how common is it for someone with a violent history and multiple arrests, multiple convictions to actually be released on a written promise to appear? Are we seeing it because of this no cash bail? Are we seeing it more often than not?
We're seeing it because of no cash bail policies more and more. So it is prevalent in our inner cities. Look at Chicago and Illinois. What we've talked about already, that's posting cash with the court, either a percentage or posting the full amount of the bond. So that's just the cash going to the court. So they've used more and more of those types of releases because that's all they have in their state left. They don't have the private surety bail system. And so I think it's being used more and more in those types of places. I think we're in a period where things are starting to roll back. So we had probably 5 or 6 years where areas were pushing for these bail reforms. And then as we see they fail, like in New York, they passed reforms, but they've now rolled them back 3 times. I think we're starting to see things stiffen up. In Texas has always gone the opposite direction. They've strengthened their criminal justice system. They have limited the use of the simple release mechanisms for violent offenses, so that they're making it harder to be released that way. But I mean, during the pandemic, we had a terrible problem in Harris County because historically in Texas, you couldn't get released on a personal bond for capital murder. But during the pandemic, Harris County started releasing people on just their promise on those charges, and then they would go out and commit a second murder. I mean, I started speaking in front of groups saying, you get 1 free murder in Harris County before they're going to hold you, and you may be released on a personal bond to do it. I mean, I think in Texas, it's being limited less, but we still have some urban areas where they're pushing to use it more. When you have soft on crime DAs, they're pushing to use it more. And then we have all these studies that we're fighting about. Do these types of releases increase crime, or do they have no impact on crime? There's no study that says it decreases crime. What the studies all fight about is crime is increasing, but is it because of these policies? Common sense would say yes, but they try to do everything they can to cook the books to say, well, either there's no evidence or we don't think it is. It's just crazy.
That is crazy. Because we all know criminals do not obey the law. So do you honestly think that they're going to say, yeah, I promise I'll be back next Tuesday at 1:00, and then actually show up? Common sense would tell you that that's not even going to happen. So,
well, and common sense would also say when they screw up, even if it's a screw up, they get scared and they run. I mean, because that's the reason why they're in the criminal justice system. They made silly decisions. They made terrible decisions. And so, I mean, running after a stupid failure to appear is the same thing. But, when the activists start talking about these, we should only hold them accountable when it's a willful failure to appear. Well, when they were stupid initially and then they decide to willfully run, it doesn't change that it was a stupid initially decision. So under the activist arguments, we can't hold them accountable even for that. I mean, so we're just being held hostage to their voluntary willingness to come to court. No, that's not how our criminal justice system should work.
Not at all. Do you think that mental illness plays a factor into whether a person gets released or not?
Yes, I do. And I think that it's something that's a problem historically because, we've kind of gotten rid of all of our mental health networks that we used to have decades ago. And they've all kind of been put into the criminal justice system, are the biggest ones. In most states, the largest mental health facility is in the criminal justice system or the county jails. And so the problem we have now is in this bail reform craziness where we're like, well, these people have mental health issues. They shouldn't be in the criminal justice system. Well, the problem is we don't have anywhere else to put them. So we're using the mental health thing as a King's X to dismiss the criminal case because we don't want them in the criminal justice system, but we're not sending them anywhere else because there's nowhere else to send them. So that turns the jail into a revolving door where they get in the jail, they get on their meds, they get controllable, they get released, the case gets dismissed, they get off their meds, they get in trouble, they get arrested. So it's a cycle over and over.
I totally agree. So in your opinion, what metrics should we actually be looking at to evaluate bail reform in an honest, straightforward type of way?
Well, the problem with evaluating bail reform is because it's difficult. And the reason why is because we don't have we can't look at things clearly. Let me give you an example. So as an attorney, historically, when 2 attorneys are arguing a case, they're going to come to different conclusions. They're going to tell the judge, you should say yes on this, or you should say no on this. But the problem is that's the application of the law to the facts. We're just interpreting the law differently. The problem is the facts are the facts. We should all agree on what the facts are. And we even say, well, that's just a fact. Well, we're kind of in this period where we can't even agree on the facts. And so when we're dealing with bail reform, the people that are advocating for it will never agree it's not working. And we can never agree with them on metrics to measure measure whether it's working or not. And on top of that, they have a different whole idea of what working for bail reform is. They think a reduction of the number of people in jail is success for bail reform. So they don't want to look at whether crime is increasing. In fact, they'll deny crime is increasing, even if you point out to them, wait a minute, we've released 25% more people. Even if crime is still being committed on the same percentage, that's more crime than before because we were holding more people in jail. They will agree, but they'll say it's not more crime. It's just on a percentage basis, it's the same crime. And so they have a different idea of what success is. And their idea of success doesn't have anything to do with public safety. And it doesn't have anything to do with crime. They're willing for crime to go up under their metric. And we would never be willing to agree to that.
Exactly. So are we seeing more crime or the perception of more crime, or is there really more crime going on because of this no cash bail?
Okay, I think that's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways. I'm going to argue it before the most recent presidential election, and then after the most recent presidential election. So for the last 2 years, before Trump was elected to his second term, we've been having all these articles from activist groups saying, crime is not really going up. It's just a perception of crime, and you shouldn't believe your lying eyes, you should believe us. And then they would conclude, and by the way, you don't have to just take our word for it. Look at the FBI statistics. The FBI statistics show crime is down. And then October of last year, I wrote an article about we should not be looking at the FBI statistics because here's a whole bunch of reasons why they're not accurate. They're switching over to a new system. You have to buy new equipment to be able to report to the new system. We have some of our largest cities in the country that are not enrolled in the new system. And we have all these other things that measure crime, some of them by the federal government, that are not in agreement with the FBI statistics. Well, then probably 2 weeks later or less, suddenly the FBI statistics were updated because some large police departments got enrolled in the system, and suddenly crime was showing that it was up when for 2 years they were saying it was down. And so suddenly, right before the election, these same activist groups stopped talking about crime entirely. And they started talking about Trump as a fascist, Trump as Hitler. And so they just completely quit talking about crime because their whole narrative was destroyed. And I think clearly crime was going up and has been going up for a period of time. But now that Trump has been in office and we have been systematically removing criminal illegal aliens, I think it's undisputed that crime has gone down in our urban areas. The murder rate from across the United States is at a historic low. That's a direct result of actions of President Trump in removing criminal aliens. Look at what's gone on in D.C., probably Nashville. Look at Minnesota and Indianapolis. Even though they were fighting what the government was doing, crime has gone down substantially since that happened. So I would argue that the actions of enforcing our borders and targeting criminal illegal aliens has had an absolute positive impact on our crime going down. And it's had that impact for two reasons. Number one, we have this city within the city of criminals, because 60 or 65% of all crimes done by a small group of people. But we have this gray area between the two cities, the law and order citizens and the criminal citizens. And the people who live in the gray area are always looking to see what's the consequences of the crime city, what's the accountability. And if there is none, well, then they're going to decide to be in the crime city. But if there are consequences, and if there's accountability, then they're going to be in the law and order city. I think what Trump has done has had a profound impact on the gray area between the two cities, and also has reduced the population of the crime city, and that's had a positive impact on reducing crime.
Okay, so let's talk about accountability for just a minute. When a defendant is released and they actually commit another crime, who's held accountable for that other than the criminal? Legally and practically, who should be held accountable?
the criminal should always be responsible for his own act. There's a lot of people would argue, well, whoever released him should be held accountable. But we've got all of these rules about sovereign immunity or absolute immunity. A judge has immunity from their actions as a judge, and we can't sue the state or the city because they have sovereign immunity. So we've set up a system where when we make mistakes, we have to pay, and when the government makes mistakes, we still have to pay. So I think that's probably what is probably there. But I mean, we're starting to see some arguments. Well, who else can be held accountable? So if I'm a bondsman, or if a bondsman bails someone out of court and then they commit another crime, should the bondsman be responsible for what they do when they're out? I mean, the only thing, the bondsman's not ensuring that nobody else is going to get hurt. They're ensuring that they will show up for court. And so that's what they're promising. What if you want, I mean, we're slowing down cases getting through the system. That's one problem. But there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of, I would probably even agree we should hold the judge accountable. But the accountability that historically we've held on the judge is elect somebody new at the next election, not hold them responsible for anything that happens while the guy's out on bond.
Right. I know here in Ohio we have what's called absolute immunity, which means, prosecutors aren't accountable when wrongful convictions happen. They're not liable. The judges aren't liable. Oops, we made a mistake, move on. So in that aspect, we're actually trying to reform that now here in Ohio to hold them accountable when they don't do their job correctly. Not just let's elect somebody new. It's, hey, you are criminally liable for allowing the guilty party to stay out of jail and incarcerating the innocent person. So that's what we're working on here to try and, is it going to happen? I don't know. Probably not.
Okay. So, look, this touches on some really good points here. And what I would encourage you when you're making these arguments would be to focus on a willful intent, or, if the prosecutor is prosecuting somebody and then is not acting in good faith, so there's something in the record to show that he's either been vindictive or that he had an ulterior motive, then I think you're going to go somewhere further with that. Where I've seen these types of arguments in the past from the activist groups that I'm very critical of, it's like getting rid of, what is the principle that protects police when they're making an action, as long as they're, so there's some kind of concept where the police where they have some type of immunity. And, there's been pushes to get rid of that from the police standpoint. But my response to that is, if you do that, you'll never have someone apply to be a police officer.
Right.
Because think about it. You've got all these activist groups that just have all kinds of money. And if they just get mad at you, then if you get rid of this immunity, qualified immunity is the concept for police, then it's every time they want to second guess what you're doing or just pick on you, then you got a jury trial and you're going to spend a fortune in attorney's fees. You will never have anyone be a police officer in your town. So we have to have a concept of qualified immunity to protect them from the egregious being picked on by the other side. And so I still think you need some concept of that with prosecutors, as long as they were acting in good faith, or as long as they were not acting with bad faith. And when you add that bad faith requirement, sure, it makes it more difficult to hold somebody accountable, but you have a standard.
Right.
And you know what you're looking for. And also, you're going to have more willingness from the legislature or from the courts to then kind of adopt your rule. So I'm okay with let's hold district attorneys accountable if they were acting in bad faith. But I don't know about, it's kind of like the stupid rule versus the willful rule. We're talking failure to appear, the damage is the same. But if they weren't acting in bad faith, I'm not sure the same argument applies that we could prosecute any prosecutor for a wrongful conviction. I think it has the same dampening effect on prosecutors that we have on police officers if we don't put some kind of acting in bad faith requirement on it.
I agree. 100% agree. Because at the end of the day, prosecutors are human. They make mistakes just like police officers do. they make mistakes. When it becomes an issue is when you have a prosecutor who prosecutes a case that is semi-high profile, and then all of a sudden, after the conviction goes through, they get a promotion. And then you find out that the evidence wasn't even real.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that's a problem that we probably had more decades ago, where prosecutors were watching their conviction rate and they were getting promotions based upon their convictions.
Yep.
And so I think that probably the wrongful convictions has probably lowered that some, but we got to have quality from our prosecutors. I mean, I tell bondsmen all the time that if your prosecutor is willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, then you've got a prosecutor worth their weight in gold. I think that's true on anything, any part of the criminal justice system. If you've got a prosecutor who gives you the benefit of the doubt on your arguments, you've got someone worth their weight in gold.
Absolutely. I normally don't get involved in politics too much on the show, but I think with the topic that we're talking about, I think it's fair to ask, what do you think the Trump executive order is trying to accomplish? Is it public safety? Is it something that's political pressure? Or do you have another idea on this whole no cash bail stuff?
Well, okay, so I'm going to ask listeners to set aside Trump entirely for just a moment, and then I'll come back to Trump. But let's just say that my numbers about failure to appear rates are accurate. You've got a failure to appear rate of less than 10% for the private industry, which is cash bail. And then for cashless bail, you have a failure to appear rate of 50, 60, 70, or 80%. I mean, you can see the impact. I mean, an 80% failure to appear rate means you have to have twice the amount of courts or more to cover and prosecute the same number of cases where you have the private industry, and the private industry doesn't cost the government anything. So if you're looking at it just from a failure to appear rate, and we assume that my numbers are correct, then you could say it's a pure public safety thing. It's just economics. The getting rid of cashless bail just makes sense. And if you just look at it that way, if we assume that my numbers are correct, then you're like, why would you ever do anything else? And then now let's come back to Trump. Well, it's Trump, so obviously it's wrong. And then you have the activists who will not agree that their bad bail reform measures are not working. So it just clutters everything. Well, we have to oppose it because it's Trump. Trump is bad. Trump has got, yellow hair. We got Trump derangement syndrome. We can't even admit he's done anything right, and we can't admit that it's not working. So there's an evil intent. And you can see how politics makes it where we can't even have an honest discussion about whether a policy is working. And so it requires the federal government to come in, and the president does an executive order. And I think he's doing it because he's well-intended. I mean, can you imagine the president of the United States, who's a Republican, trying to dictate to urban cities, which are almost always Democrat-run cities, that what they're doing is not in their best interest? I mean, historically, a Republican wouldn't even look at that because it doesn't matter. They're not going to have any success there. For Trump to be doing that, he's trying to improve the lives of our citizens who live in our urban areas. He doesn't get any votes for that. And so he doesn't have any motive other than to try to make it better. But there will be people listening to this and saying, I'm crazy because Trump's bad.
Oh, God, you got to love Trump derangement syndrome. Love it. I never let anybody know what my political affiliation is, but let's make America great again and go back to constitutional law. Just saying.
Well, I will say historically, both of our national parties have been law and order policies. We had a period of time in the 60s where one party kind of got off its rails, and it ended up because we felt safe, so we were more forgiving on our criminal laws, and crime started going up. The parties couldn't agree on how to address it. One party refused, and so we had a backlash, and that resulted in Reagan getting elected in the 80s, and we had the war on drugs. I would say we've just committed the same cycle, and so we need one more national election where we vote on crime, and I think both parties will revert back to their historical law and order platform. And then we can fight about all these other identity politics issues, but we need one more election cycle on crime.
I agree. So you've actually written about what successful bail reform looks like. What are the non-negotiables in a model that's both fair and safe?
I think the number one non-negotiable is you require judges to review criminal histories. Criminal history is the number one predictor of what you're going to do in the future. And so a first-time offender should be treated differently than someone who has a 3-page criminal history. And I think another non-negotiable is putting a strong accountability element into our system. So if you fail to show up for court, there's consequences. Like if you get a simple release, if you fail to show up, you don't get a simple release a second time. You know, in Texas, a lot of counties, if you have a $10,000 bond and you fail to show up, well, then that bond's forfeited and your bond gets reset at $20,000. You know, it doesn't take very many failures to appear and you can't afford to get out of jail. The activists would say, oh, that's terrible. That violates the Constitution. But they would also say we can't have accountability.
Right.
We can't hold anybody in jail on an amount of bail that's a bond that they say they can't afford. That argument's been rejected by the courts. They just won't admit it. So I think criminal history is huge, and I think accountability. And then I think what some courts are doing because of the activists is they're limiting the use of this simple release for violent offenses. And I'm not going to say that's a non-negotiable, but it's getting to be one because politics is becoming too big of an issue in our criminal justice system. I know we're always going to have politics in it, but politics, when we're talking about, we're going to use simple release, even if it has an 80% failure to appear rate, because that's what your party wants, we got a problem.
Yeah, because you're not keeping society safe as a whole. You're giving the perception of being nice so we don't hurt their feelings.
Well, that's why they argue they won't admit crime's going up because they can't, because it's their policies that they implemented. And if they admit that the policies that they implemented increased crime, well, they'd be voted out of office. So and then the activists hold the party, one party hostage, because if you decide, hey, I've looked at this, it's not working, so we're going to try something else. Well, the activists are going to come in and they're going to put up somebody else to run against you, and then you're going to be out of office. And you've been a politician for 20 years. What are you going to do? I mean, all you know how to do is be a politician.
Right. So on this simple release that you guys have in Texas, would you think like adding conditions like GPS monitoring or check-ins or anything like that would actually help it and help more of those people actually show up, or would it be just more wasted money?
You know what I really think is that it's wasted money. Those things usually cost more than the private industry would cost. And so it gives you an illusion of that they're doing something. So it's actually the illusion of the activists proposing that something be done that's at a higher cost and less benefit. So there's no release mechanism that has more supervision than the private industry, but the activists, consider the private industry Satan, so they can't admit to that. So they push those very same things. But the problem is the government never runs those things well. We've had so many examples of, GPS monitors getting cut off on the weekend. Well, the government's closed for the weekend, so there's nobody monitoring on the weekend. So if they just wait till 6 o'clock on Friday, cut off their GPS monitor, they got a 3-day head start, 2.5, before anybody's even going to know. And so I think that those end up costing a lot more for the defendant and putting them in a worse position than if we just given a bond by a private industry. I mean, probably the biggest data we have is Yolo County in California they kept all their data from COVID, and then they set out a report, and the report compared 2 nonviolent offenders, one released on simple release, one released on a private surety bail bond, and they found that the person released on simple release, even though it was a nonviolent offense, they had a 200% greater chance of committing a new violent offense in the next 18 months over the person released on a private surety bond. I mean, wow. If I'm a member of the public, I would look at that and I would say, I never want my family member released on simple release. Not if they have a 200% greater chance of being in a worse situation in 18 months.
Right.
But the activists, that's what they're arguing for, because they don't care what the statistics say. They don't care. It's all talking points. It's all geared towards elections. It doesn't have anything to do with about improving the criminal justice system.
Speaking of elections, I'm going to throw this at you real quick because I had a conversation about this with somebody yesterday. Do you think that prosecutors tend to be tougher when it's an election year versus when it's not an election year? Not necessarily tougher on crime, so to speak, but like I've noticed in doing what I do with wrongful convictions and stuff like that and reading through case files, a lot of the times that these cases get pushed through that are wrongful convictions is because it's an election year and it's a semi-public case. So they tend to push them through no matter what. And then, well, there's always appeals down the road.
I think the simple answer is yes. I can't tell you how many times I've seen, and I'm not critical of this, but high-profile cases that are either dismissed or they give a low sentence because the evidence is bad. Sometimes they seem to happen after the election. So there's 4 years to forget about it before the next election. And I do think, whether it's intentional or unintentional, I can see district attorneys who's running for re-election say, we need to show the public we're tough on crime. I'm not really critical of that. I don't have a problem with DAs being tough on crime. But I am sympathetic to pushing a weak case to trial in like my home county in Texas, because in my home county in Texas, it's very conservative, and they're going to tend to believe the police and not the defendant. And so on a really weak case, I can see that, I know a case that went through the criminal justice system when I moved to Tyler, where I live. And it was a murder case, and it was a family, and it was terrible. And I think it went to trial so many times, and I think it ended up with a hung jury the first time. Then it went to a jury trial the second time. They convicted. It went up on appeal, and on appeal it was thrown out. And they came back. They may have even tried to convict it again, and then went up on appeal and was thrown out. And then finally they came back and they dismissed the case. But the problem is, someone had been in prison for probably 20 years in all of that.
Oh wow, that's crazy.
And that's a well-publicized case from our part of Texas.
If there was one thing that you could change tomorrow, be it law, policy, or just the way we do things, what would reduce harm the fastest?
Ooh, one thing that I could change. This is going to sound, people aren't going to believe me when I say this. If I could reduce simple release, we would be safer. Our cases would get through the criminal justice system more quickly, and we would need fewer courts. Because of the failure to appear rates being so much lower. But that's not going to happen. But that is the reality.
I agree. My last question for you is for the people that are listening and they're trying to think clearly. What questions should they be asking their local DAs, judges, and legislators about pretrial release?
What should they be asking about pretrial release? They should be asking about what mechanisms, what are the systems of pretrial release? What release systems are they advocating for? The reason why we have this simple release is because we have, kind of a constitutional requirement. We have to have that as an option to protect the poor. The problem is once you have a criminal history, if we set bail an amount you can't afford, it's not because you're poor, it's because you have a criminal history. And so I think the questions we should be asking is, if your failure to appear rate is so bad on this release system, then why are you ever advocating for it? Why are you ever agreeing to it, except for the very, very rare situations? And I don't even advocate for really simple release to be used on most first-time offenders. If it has such a high failure to appear rate, it's going to put everybody in a worse position. So it needs to be used very rarely. But I think, and then if you do that, your district attorneys will stop even allowing simple release for all violent offenders, because can you imagine going before the public for re-election and you agreed to a simple release for someone who then went out and hurt somebody, who, heaven forbid, killed somebody. I mean, I know of an example, multiple examples, but in Harris County, there was a guy on a personal bond. He got arrested for assaulting his wife, and he got another simple release, and he went home and killed his wife. Stabbed her 30-something times in her stomach because she was pregnant, and he didn't want anyone else to raise his child if she survived, and he killed them both.
And had he had some kind of monetary on his bail,
then he would have had, yes, he would have taken longer to get out. He would have quieted down or calmed down. He would have been still angry, and he would have had to have family involvement to get out, because the private industry is dealing with family. And once you get family involved, that's the secret sauce to getting people to conform, to become productive citizens, to change what they're doing, to not make another stupid mistake along with the stupid mistake they just made.
I agree. Absolutely. And because of the way the world is going right now and doing away with the family unit and the family support, and you're just throwing people out there and just, here you go, do what you want to do. Nobody's there to support you. Nobody's there to help. Nobody's there to quote unquote police you. You know, when you've got a strong family unit, then you've got people that are going, hey, you can't do that. You got to go back to court. No, we're not doing this.
You know, I have a really good story to tell on that, because 35 years ago, I had a sister who had a car accident, and she broke every bone in her face. And she had surgeries for years, but she started a 30-year drug addiction to prescription drug addiction. And, as a brand new attorney, with all these student loans, I'm just as poor as can be. And, at that time, the poor man's drug rehab was jail. And my sister got arrested leaving a crack house or leaving some kind of drug place. And I tried everything I could to get her in jail. I wanted her in jail so we could get her cleaned up. But, she had some resources, and she was able to avoid it. I mean, she sold everything she had to avoid it. But that's a really good example. Today, with these bad bail reform policies, we're actually getting rid of the poor man's option. They have no option. The families don't, because their people are just getting released, and they don't get clean. They don't have an option to clean them out and get their attention. Right. And we're losing a generation on it.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you can think of that you would like my listeners to know?
Well, I would say if people want to know more information about my group or me, they can go to pbtx.com. That's our website, the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. We have a blog where we post important criminal justice stories, and we also have our own podcast. There's a link on our menu, but you can also go directly to thebailpost.com, and all we do is talk about bail reform, what works, what doesn't work, criminal justice reform. We actually highlight studies, and we also I have a new podcast coming out where we're going to be talking about the science from the activist groups, which is really just a pseudoscience where they just spout out mumbo jumbo, or they cook the books to try to say, bad bail reform is working. Even though crime is going up, it's not because of us. And it's just studies that say, ignore your common sense. But that's probably what I would highlight.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that information. I'll definitely be checking that out myself.
Good.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to sit here and have a little chit chat with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's definitely been enlightening for me. I've learned some new things today, and I appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm very kind.
That was my interview with Ken W. Good. Whether you agreed with every point or not, I appreciate conversations like this, because bail reform can't be built on slogans. It has to be built on facts, real-world outcomes, and accountability. If this episode hit home for you, here are a few ways you can help us keep this work moving. Follow Wickedly Judged on your favorite podcast platforms so you never miss an episode, because these conversations don't end when the recording stops. Share this episode with one person. Text it, post it, or send it to someone who cares about justice reform, works in the system, or has been impacted by it. The more people who hear the truth, the harder it is to ignore. Leave a rating and a written review. It may seem small, but it's one of the biggest ways to help this podcast reach new listeners, especially people searching for content on wrongful convictions, bail reform, and accountability. Join the conversation. Comment on our post and tell us what you think. Should no cash bail be the standard, or does reform need stronger safeguards? What does accountability look like in your community? Support the mission directly. If you're able, consider donating or grabbing advocacy merch. Every dollar helps us keep investigating, educating, advocating, and activating. And finally, if you have a case you believe needs attention, or you have documents, leads, or resources that could help an investigation, reach out. We review submissions and we take this work very seriously. Thank you for standing with us, because justice shouldn't depend on money, connections, or luck. As always, stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay hopeful, because nobody deserves to be wickedly judged.